The date was July 25th, 1944. The place, a dusty road near Saint-Lô in Normandy, France. Oberstleutnant Friedrich von Kriegen stood in the turret of his command half-track, scanning the sky with binoculars as his mechanized column of over 200 vehicles stretched along the narrow French road behind him. His regiment, the 275th Infantry Division's Supply and Transport Battalion, was moving desperately needed ammunition and fuel to German positions holding against the American breakout. The morning had been quiet, almost peaceful, and von Kriegen allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. The Luftwaffe had assured them that Allied air activity would be minimal due to weather. That assurance would prove catastrophically wrong. The sound came first. A distant thunder that seemed to roll across the Norman countryside like an approaching storm. Von Kriegen's driver, a veteran of the Eastern Front, went pale. He knew that sound. Every German soldier in France knew that sound by the summer of 1944. It was the deep, rumbling roar of Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines, superchargers screaming as they pushed massive fighters through the air at over 300 miles per hour, the thunder of the P-47 Thunderbolts. Von Kriegen grabbed his radio handset and screamed the order that had become all too familiar. "Jabos, take cover," but it was already too late. 16 P-47D Thunderbolts of the 406th Fighter Group appeared over the ridgeline at less than 500 feet altitude, arrayed in perfect four-ship formations. To the German soldiers scrambling from their vehicles, they looked like dark crosses of death painted against the summer sky. Each aircraft carried 2 1,000-pound bombs under its wings, a 500-pound bomb under the fuselage, and 8 Browning M2 heavy machine guns loaded with 3,400 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition. The combined payload of this single flight exceeded 40,000 pounds of high explosive and nearly 500,000 rounds of half-inch projectiles. What happened in the next 4 minutes would be recorded in unit histories on both sides as one of the most devastating ground attacks of the entire war. The lead flight rolled into their attack dive at a 30-degree angle, pickled their bombs at 500 feet, and opened fire with their guns at 800 yards. The bombs fell in a perfect stick along the road, detonating in massive eruptions of earth and steel that threw vehicles into the air like toys. Behind the explosions came the guns. 8 streams of tracer fire from each aircraft converged on the column, the combined rate of fire exceeding 48,000 rounds per minute from the 16 fighters. At this range, with armor-piercing incendiary rounds designed to penetrate tank armor, the effect on soft-skinned trucks and half-tracks was apocalyptic. Vehicles didn't just burn, they disintegrated. Fuel trucks exploded in fireballs that consumed everything within 50 yards. Ammunition trucks detonated in chain reactions that sent secondary explosions rippling down the column for minutes after the fighters had passed. Von Kriegen, thrown from his half-track by a near miss, lay in a ditch and watched in horror as his entire battalion ceased to exist. The Thunderbolts made 3 passes, each one lasting less than 30 seconds, each one adding to the carnage. By the time the American fighters pulled away, trailing smoke from their gun barrels heated white-hot by sustained fire, 187 vehicles were destroyed or burning. Over 400 German soldiers were dead or wounded. The entire strike from first bomb impact to last gunburst had lasted 240 seconds. The road to Saint-Lô was impassable, choked with burning wreckage. The ammunition and fuel von Kriegen had been transporting would never reach the front line. The German defensive position it was meant to supply would collapse within 48 hours, contributing directly to the American breakout from Normandy. And this was just one attack, on one road, on one day. This is the story of how the P-47 Thunderbolt, originally designed as a high-altitude interceptor to dogfight German fighters in the stratosphere, became the most feared ground attack aircraft of World War II. It's a story about how American pilots and engineers transformed a pure fighter into a devastating weapon system, capable of destroying entire German armoured columns in minutes. It's about the tactics, technology and sheer firepower that made the Thunderbolt the terror of every German soldier who heard its approach. And it's about how the Luftwaffe's mockery of this ungainly American fighter turned to absolute dread as those 8 machine guns and racks of bombs systematically destroyed German military power on the ground. The P-47 Thunderbolt was never meant to be a ground attack aircraft. When Alexander Kartveli designed it in 1940, his vision was singular and focused. Create the ultimate high-altitude interceptor. Build a fighter that could climb to 40,000 feet and destroy German bombers before they could reach American cities. The result was a machine that defied every conventional assumption about fighter design. At 10,000 pounds empty weight, it was the heaviest single-engine fighter in the world. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower, more than most medium bombers. Its armament of 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns represented more firepower than entire fighter squadrons from just a few years earlier. The early combat history of the P-47 in Europe focused exclusively on air-to-air combat. From April through December 1943, Thunderbolt groups escorted bombers deep into German territory, engaging Luftwaffe fighters in brutal aerial battles that gradually ground down German fighter strength. But during these missions, American pilots began noticing something interesting. When they strafed airfields or targets of opportunity while returning from escort missions, the results were devastatingly effective. The heavy machine gun armament that some critics had dismissed as inferior to cannon proved extraordinarily lethal against ground targets. The armor-piercing incendiary ammunition designed to destroy aircraft was equally effective against vehicles, locomotives, and structures. And the P-47's legendary durability, which allowed it to absorb incredible battle damage and still fly home, meant pilots could press attacks to point-blank range without fear. The transformation from pure fighter to fighter-bomber began in earnest in early 1944 as Allied planners prepared for the invasion of France. The strategic concept was straightforward but ambitious. Use overwhelming air power to paralyze German military movement, destroy their supplies before they reached the front, and make daylight operations suicidal for Wehrmacht forces. To accomplish this required aircraft that could carry meaningful bomb loads, survive intense anti-aircraft fire, deliver accurate attacks, and still fight their way past German fighters. The P-47 Thunderbolt met every requirement and exceeded them. The first major test came in February 1944 during Operation Argument, the big week offensive against German aircraft production. While bomber crews focused on factories, P-47 groups were tasked with attacking airfields and ground installations across occupied Europe. The results shocked even optimistic American planners. In a single week, 9th Air Force Thunderbolts destroyed over 200 locomotives, nearly 500 trucks, and dozens of fuel dumps and ammunition stores. More significantly, they discovered that the P-47 could carry bombs while maintaining its fighter capabilities. Unlike dedicated attack aircraft that became vulnerable when loaded, the Thunderbolt remained fast, maneuverable, and deadly even with external stores. By March 1944, engineers had developed standardized bomb racks that allowed P-47s to carry 2 1,000-pound bombs under the wings or a single 500-pound bomb under the fuselage. The installation required minimal modification. The aircraft's massive wing structure, originally overbuilt to handle high-G maneuvers at altitude, easily accommodated the additional load. The powerful engine provided enough thrust to maintain combat performance, even when carrying 2,500 pounds of ordnance. Most remarkably, the bombs could be jettisoned instantly if enemy fighters appeared, allowing the P-47 to transition from bomber to fighter in seconds. The real revolution came with the addition of high-velocity aircraft rockets. The 5-inch HVAR, developed specifically for the P-47, carried a 23-pound warhead equivalent to a 105mm artillery shell. Each rocket was ballistically matched to the Thunderbolt's machine guns, meaning pilots could aim using the same gun sight they used for strafing. A P-47 could carry 10 rockets on zero-length stubs under the wings, providing standoff capability against heavily defended targets. The rockets were electrically fired in ripple salvos, creating devastating patterns of destruction that could saturate an area the size of a football field in seconds. The combination of bombs, rockets, and 8 heavy machine guns created an unprecedented weapon system. A single P-47 on a ground attack mission carried more destructive power than a World War I infantry company. A 4-ship flight carried more firepower than an entire artillery battalion. And unlike artillery, which required extensive logistics, survey work, and ammunition resupply, the P-47s appeared without warning, delivered their payload with precision, and disappeared before effective countermeasures could be organized. The tactical employment of P-47s in ground attack evolved rapidly through trial and error. Early missions in March and April 1944 revealed both the aircraft's strengths and the challenges of low-altitude combat. German anti-aircraft defences, particularly the deadly 88mm guns and quad-mounted 20mm cannon, proved capable of inflicting severe losses on aircraft, making predictable straight-line attacks. Several Thunderbolts were lost in the first weeks of dedicated ground attack operations, shot down by flak during bomb runs or strafing passes. The solution came from experienced pilots who understood the P-47's unique capabilities. Instead of the shallow dive-bombing attacks used by dedicated attack aircraft, Thunderbolt pilots developed high-speed dive tactics that exploited the aircraft's exceptional dive performance. The standard attack profile became iconic. Approach the target at 10,000 to 12,000 feet altitude, beyond the effective range of light flak. Roll inverted and pull into a 60 to 70 degree dive, using the P-47's tremendous weight to build speed rapidly. The aircraft would accelerate past 450 miles per hour in the dive, making it nearly impossible for gunners to track. At 3,000 feet, release bombs, then continue the dive, opening fire with machine guns at 1,500 feet. The guns would fire continuously until pull-out at 500 feet, the combined burst lasting 4 to 5 seconds and putting hundreds of rounds into the target area. This tactic leveraged everything that made the P-47 special, the structural strength that allowed it to dive at speeds approaching the sound barrier without breaking apart, the powerful engine that could pull out of near-vertical dives without stalling, the concentrated firepower that could destroy targets in a single pass, and the armour protection that allowed pilots to press attacks through defensive fire that would have shredded lighter aircraft. As D-Day approached, P-47 groups intensified their attacks on German transportation infrastructure. The campaign, called the Transportation Plan, aimed to make it impossible for German forces to move reinforcements to Normandy after the invasion. Every bridge, rail yard, locomotive, and major road junction in northern France became a target. The statistics from May 1944 alone reveal the scale of destruction. 9th Air Force Thunderbolts flew over 15,000 sorties, dropped 7,000 tons of bombs, and fired 11 million rounds of ammunition. They destroyed 475 locomotives, 3,200 rail cars, 2,100 trucks, and cut rail lines in over 800 locations. The impact on German military capability was profound. By early June, Wehrmacht commanders reported that daylight movement of troops or supplies was effectively impossible anywhere within 150 miles of the coast. Units attempting to move by road in daylight suffered catastrophic losses. Rail traffic had been reduced to nighttime operations only, and even then faced constant interdiction. The German military machine, which had conquered most of Europe through rapid mechanized movement, was being systematically paralyzed by American fighter bombers. On June 6, 1944, the day of the Normandy invasion, over 500 P-47 Thunderbolts provided air cover and close air support for the landing forces. Their primary mission was to keep the Luftwaffe away from the beaches and to destroy any German ground forces attempting to counterattack. The effectiveness exceeded even optimistic projections. German fighters attempting to reach the invasion zone were massacred. Ground forces trying to move toward the beaches were destroyed from the air before they could engage Allied troops. By nightfall of D-Day, the Luftwaffe had flown fewer than 300 sorties against the invasion, and German ground forces had been unable to mount any coordinated counterattack. The weeks following D-Day saw P-47s fully embrace their role as the primary Allied tank busters and ground attack specialists. As American, British and Canadian forces fought to break out of the Normandy beachhead, German armoured divisions attempted to contain the invasion. These panzer divisions, equipped with Tiger and Panther tanks that were nearly invincible in ground combat, proved helplessly vulnerable to air attack. The P-47s developed specialised tactics for attacking German armour. Rockets were used for standoff attacks against tanks, with pilots aiming for the thin top armour that was vulnerable to the shaped charge warheads. Machine gun fire was concentrated on support vehicles, fuel trucks, and the wheeled transport that accompanied armoured units. The psychological impact on German tankers was devastating. Interviews with captured German armour crews from June and July 1944 revealed near-universal fear of Allied fighter bombers, particularly the P-47. Crew members described the terror of hearing the distinctive thunder of approaching Thunderbolts while buttoned up inside their tanks, knowing that their 100mm frontal armour meant nothing against an attack from above. Tank commanders reported that crew efficiency dropped dramatically when aircraft were reported in the area, with some crews abandoning perfectly functional tanks rather than face air attack. One of the most effective P-47 tactics against armour became known as the cab rank system. Fighter-bomber flights would orbit over the battlefield at medium altitude, in radio contact with ground controllers embedded with frontline troops. When German armour was spotted, the controllers would vector P-47s directly onto the target, providing real-time updates on enemy positions and movements. The response time from call to strike was often less than 5 minutes. German tank units discovered that any attempt to manoeuvre in daylight would bring immediate air attack. The true devastation of P-47 ground attack capability became horrifyingly clear during Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy in late July 1944. The operation called for carpet bombing of German positions by heavy bombers, followed by a ground assault supported by continuous fighter-bomber attacks. On July 25th, as American infantry and armour pushed through the shattered German defences, over 400 P-47s provided continuous close air support, attacking any German unit attempting to organise resistance. Major Robert York, leading the 362nd Fighter Group that day, described the scene. The entire German front collapsed under our attacks. Everywhere you looked, vehicles were burning, troops were fleeing, units were disintegrating. We flew 4 missions that day, and each time we returned to rearm and refuel, we launched again within an hour. The ground crews were loading bombs and rockets as fast as they could work. We must have fired 200,000 rounds and dropped 300 tons of bombs in our group alone. The Germans simply ceased to exist as an organised fighting force. The statistics from Operation Cobra revealed the scale of destruction P-47s could inflict. In 3 days, 9th Air Force Thunderbolts destroyed over 400 German tanks and armoured vehicles, 500 trucks and transport vehicles, 150 artillery pieces, and countless personnel casualties. Entire German divisions were rendered combat ineffective. The Panzer-Lehr Division, one of Germany's elite armoured formations, lost over 70% of its combat power to air attack alone. The division commander reported that his unit had been destroyed not by ground combat, but by American fighter bombers that attacked continuously without respite. As Allied forces broke out of Normandy and began the race across France in August 1944, P-47 groups transitioned to armed reconnaissance missions. Flights of 4 to 8 Thunderbolts would patrol assigned sectors, hunting for German vehicles, trains, and troop concentrations. The rules of engagement were simple. If it moves and it's in occupied territory, it's a target. The results were catastrophic for German forces attempting to retreat. Every road became a killing ground. Every daylight movement invited destruction. The Falaise Pocket, where German forces attempting to escape the Allied encirclement were trapped in a shrinking perimeter, became a slaughter pen. For 5 days in mid-August, P-47s attacked continuously, destroying everything that moved. Pilots described returning from missions physically sick from the carnage they had witnessed. Entire German columns were immolated, tens of thousands of vehicles burned, roads were choked with wreckage so dense that new targets couldn't even be attacked because destroyed vehicles blocked access. One P-47 pilot wrote in his diary, "We turned 20 square miles into a junkyard of smoking metal. The destruction was so complete it didn't even seem real." As the Allied advance continued toward Germany, P-47s adapted their tactics to counter increasingly desperate German defensive measures. The Luftwaffe, though largely destroyed as an effective fighting force, still posed occasional threats. German flak defences became more concentrated and lethal as they fell back toward the Reich. The weather in autumn and winter reduced flying days and complicated operations. Yet the Thunderbolts continued their relentless campaign of destruction. The addition of the paddle blade propeller to P-47D models in late 1944 improved ground attack capability significantly. The increased thrust provided by the massive 13-foot propeller blades allowed heavily loaded Thunderbolts to accelerate faster, climb more quickly, and pull out of attack dives more sharply. This translated directly into combat effectiveness. Pilots could carry heavier bomb loads, press attacks more aggressively, and evade ground fire more effectively. By September 1944, standard P-47 armament for ground attack missions included 2 1,000-pound bombs, 10 5-inch rockets, and full machine gun ammunition. The total ordnance load exceeded 3,000 pounds, equivalent to a medium bomber from 1942. Yet the P-47 remained fully capable of air-to-air combat if German fighters appeared. This dual capability proved invaluable during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, when the Thunderbolt seamlessly switched between ground attack and air superiority as the situation demanded. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West, provided the ultimate test of P-47 ground attack effectiveness. When German forces punched through American lines in the Ardennes on December 16th, bad weather initially grounded Allied air power. German commanders had specifically chosen the attack date based on weather forecasts predicting a week of low clouds and fog that would neutralize Allied air superiority. For the first few days, the gamble paid off. German armoured spearheads drove deep into American positions, and Allied aircraft were unable to intervene effectively. But on December 23rd, the weather cleared. What followed was one of the most devastating applications of air power in military history. Over 2,000 Allied aircraft, including more than 1,000 P-47s, launched continuous attacks against German armoured columns that were exposed on roads and unable to find cover. The results were catastrophic for German forces. In 5 days of intensive operations, 9th Air Force P-47s destroyed over 400 German armoured vehicles, 1,200 trucks, 500 horse-drawn vehicles, and 11 trains. More significantly, they completely disrupted German supply lines, turning the offensive into a logistical nightmare. Major George Bostwick, flying with the 56th Fighter Group during the Battle of the Bulge, described a mission on December 24th. We found a German armoured column about 40 vehicles long stretched out on a road near Bastogne. They were trying to reach the surrounded American forces. We hit them with everything. Bombs first, then rockets, then we made gun passes until our barrels were smoking. When we left, the entire column was burning. Not a single vehicle escaped. We returned an hour later with another load, and the wreckage was still burning so hot we could feel the heat in our cockpits at 1,000 feet. The psychological effect on German troops was devastating. Survivors of the Bulge offensive consistently cited American air power, particularly P-47 attacks, as the most terrifying aspect of the battle. German commanders reported that troop morale collapsed when aircraft appeared overhead. Units refused to move in daylight. Supply convoys abandoned their vehicles and fled into the woods. The Wehrmacht's last offensive in the West was effectively destroyed not primarily by ground combat, though that was significant, but by relentless air attack that made movement impossible and supply delivery suicidal. As Allied forces crossed into Germany in early 1945, P-47 groups received a new primary mission: the systematic destruction of German transportation infrastructure within the Reich itself. Every locomotive, rail yard, bridge, and road junction became a priority target. The objective was to make it impossible for German forces to move reserves, supplies, or equipment anywhere within Germany. The campaign succeeded beyond all expectations. The statistics from March 1945 alone reveal the scale of destruction. 9th Air Force P-47s destroyed 2,047 locomotives, 9,234 rail cars, 3,691 motor vehicles, 623 armoured vehicles, 284 barges, and cut rail lines in 1,972 locations. The German transportation system, already crippled by strategic bombing, was reduced to complete collapse. Coal couldn't reach factories, food couldn't reach cities, ammunition couldn't reach the front. Germany's ability to sustain military operations simply ceased to exist. The techniques P-47 pilots developed for locomotive hunting became legendary. Locomotives were priority targets because destroying them had cascading effects on the entire rail system. A single destroyed locomotive could block a rail line for days. The standard attack profile involved a nearly vertical dive from 8,000 feet, releasing bombs at 2,000 feet, then pulling up and circling to assess damage. If the locomotive was still mobile, pilots would make repeated strafing runs, concentrating fire on the boiler and firebox. The armor-piercing incendiary ammunition would penetrate the boiler plate and detonate inside, causing catastrophic steam explosions that destroyed the locomotive completely. Captain Ralph Johnson of the 365th Fighter Group described hunting locomotives in March 1945. It became almost sporting, in a grim sort of way. You'd spot a locomotive from altitude, usually by the smoke, roll into your attack dive, pickle your bombs, and pull up. If you hit it right, the boiler would explode and the locomotive would be done. If you missed, you'd make gun passes until you got the kill. Some days we'd destroy 6 or 7 locomotives per mission. The Germans tried running trains only at night, but we'd catch them at dawn or dusk. By April, you could fly for hours over Germany and not see a single moving train. The attacks on German armour in the final months of the war demonstrated how completely P-47 tactics had evolved. German tanks by early 1945 were essentially immobile pillboxes, unable to manoeuvre in daylight due to air attack. When they did attempt to move, the results were predictable and horrible. On April 14, 1945, elements of the 11th Panzer Division attempted a daylight movement near the Ruhr Pocket. 16 P-47s from the 404th Fighter Group attacked the column with bombs, rockets and guns. In 12 minutes, 43 German armoured vehicles were destroyed. The division commander surrendered his remaining forces the following day, citing the impossibility of continued operations under constant air attack. The final statistics of P-47 ground attack operations defied comprehension. From D-Day to VE Day, 9th Air Force Thunderbolts destroyed or damaged over 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armoured vehicles, 68,000 trucks, and countless other targets. They dropped over 132,000 tons of bombs and fired over 135 million rounds of ammunition. They flew over 213,000 combat sorties, more than any other aircraft type in the European theatre, and they achieved all this while maintaining a loss rate lower than any other Allied fighter bomber, testament to the P-47's legendary durability. The technological factors that made the P-47 so effective in ground attack deserved a detailed examination. The Browning M2 50 caliber machine gun, 8 of which armed every Thunderbolt, was arguably the finest aircraft weapon of World War II. Its combination of range, accuracy, rate of fire, and destructive power created a weapon system uniquely suited to ground attack. Each gun fired 800 rounds per minute, giving the P-47 a combined rate of fire of 6,400 rounds per minute. At typical strafing range of 500 yards, all 8 guns converged on a point, creating a cone of destruction that guaranteed hits on any target. The ammunition itself was a marvel of American industrial capacity. The standard combat load mixed armour-piercing incendiary tracer, and ball ammunition in specific ratios. The armour-piercing rounds used a tungsten carbide penetrator core that could pierce 25 mm of armour at 500 yards, enough to penetrate the top armour of any German tank. The incendiary compound, designed to ignite upon penetration, burned at over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to ignite fuel and ammunition. The tracer rounds allowed pilots to observe their fire and adjust aim in real time. The ballistic characteristics of the 50 caliber round made it ideal for ground attack. The bullet was heavy enough to retain energy at long range, allowing effective fire out to 1,000 yards. The trajectory was flat enough that aim point and impact point were essentially identical out to 400 yards. The bullet's sectional density allowed deep penetration into structures and vehicles, and the sheer volume of fire meant that even near misses could be effective, with ricochets and fragments causing casualties and damage. The structural strength of the P-47 was equally critical to its ground attack success. The aircraft could sustain incredible battle damage and still complete its mission. This durability allowed pilots to press attacks through defensive fire that would have been suicidal in lighter aircraft. The radial engine, lacking vulnerable coolant systems, could absorb multiple hits and continue running. The wings, built around massive spars designed for high-altitude dogfighting, could sustain major damage without failing. The fuselage, constructed from heavy-gauge aluminum with extensive internal bracing, could absorb cannon strikes and still maintain structural integrity. Numerous accounts from both Allied and German sources testified to the P-47's absurd toughness. One Thunderbolt returned from a ground attack mission with over 150 flak holes, including several 88mm shell strikes, missing 3 feet of wing and a dead engine. It still made it back to base and landed safely. Another absorbed a direct hit from a 20mm cannon that exploded inside the cockpit, wounding the pilot severely, yet flew for another 40 minutes and landed successfully. German anti-aircraft gunners reported that P-47s required far more hits to bring down than any other Allied aircraft. The psychological impact of P-47 ground attacks on German forces was profound and lasting. Post-war interviews with German soldiers revealed near-universal trauma associated with Thunderbolt attacks. The distinctive sound of approaching P-47s, a deep thundering roar created by the massive propeller and powerful engine, became a trigger for panic. German troops described the helpless terror of hearing that sound and knowing that death was seconds away. Unlike artillery, which could be anticipated and evaded, P-47 attacks came without warning and offered no escape. German medical records from late 1944 and early 1945 documented increasing cases of what doctors called air raid neurosis among frontline troops. Soldiers developed physical symptoms, tremors, nightmares, inability to concentrate when aircraft sounds were reported. Combat effectiveness degraded significantly in units that had experienced repeated air attacks. Some soldiers refused to leave foxholes even when ordered to advance. Officers reported that troop morale was more damaged by air attack than by ground combat or artillery bombardment. The broader strategic impact of P-47 ground attack operations extended far beyond the immediate destruction of vehicles and equipment. The systematic targeting of German transportation infrastructure created cascading failures throughout the Nazi war machine. Factories couldn't receive raw materials, military units couldn't receive supplies, refugees couldn't be moved, food couldn't reach cities. The German economy, already strained by years of war and strategic bombing, essentially collapsed under the weight of transportation system failure. This collapse was directly attributable to P-47 attacks. While heavy bombers destroyed factories and refineries, it was fighter bombers, primarily Thunderbolts, that destroyed the ability to move anything anywhere. A factory could be repaired, but if locomotives couldn't reach it with raw materials and couldn't ship finished products, the factory was useless. An oil refinery could produce fuel, but if the fuel couldn't be transported to frontline units, it might as well not exist. The P-47's systematic destruction of German mobility turned the entire Nazi state into a collection of isolated, non-functional fragments. The comparison between P-47 ground attack capabilities and other Allied aircraft highlighted the Thunderbolt's unique qualities. The British Hawker Typhoon, another highly effective ground attack fighter, carried rockets and bombs effectively, but lacked the P-47's high-altitude performance, range and durability. The P-51 Mustang, while an exceptional long-range escort fighter, was more fragile and carried less ordnance than the Thunderbolt. The P-38 Lightning had excellent range but proved vulnerable to ground fire. The P-47 combined heavy bomb load, devastating gun armament, exceptional durability, and fighter-level performance in a single package that no other aircraft could match. By war's end, the P-47 had evolved into the ultimate multi-role combat aircraft. It could escort bombers to Berlin and fight Luftwaffe jets at 30,000 feet. It could carry 3,000 pounds of bombs and destroy bridges and rail yards. It could fire rockets at German armour and strafe trains with its machine guns. It could absorb incredible punishment and bring its pilot home. And it could do all of this while operating from rough forward airstrips, maintained by crews working in primitive conditions with limited tools and spare parts. The legacy of P-47 ground attack operations influenced air power doctrine for decades after World War II. The concept of using heavily armed, well-protected fighters for both air superiority and ground attack became standard practice. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, developed in the 1970s specifically for close air support, was deliberately named to honour the P-47 and embodied similar design philosophy. Heavy armour, redundant systems, and overwhelming firepower focused on ground attack while maintaining air combat capability. In the final analysis, the P-47 Thunderbolt's transformation from high-altitude interceptor to the most feared ground attack aircraft of World War II represented a triumph of adaptability and effectiveness. American pilots and engineers took an aircraft designed for one mission and proved it excelled at another. They developed tactics that exploited its unique strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. They created weapon systems, bomb racks, rocket launchers, ammunition types that maximized its destructive potential, and they flew it with a level of aggression and skill that terrorized enemy ground forces. The German soldiers who witnessed P-47 attacks never forgot the experience. The thunder of those massive engines, the scream of diving aircraft, the hammer of 8 heavy machine guns, the eruption of bombs and rockets. These sounds and sights haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. In veteran reunions decades after the war, former Wehrmacht soldiers would still describe in hushed tones the absolute helplessness they felt when Thunderbolts appeared overhead. The knowledge that no armour could protect them, no speed could save them, no cover was sufficient. They could only pray that the American pilots would choose another target. That was the true measure of the P-47's effectiveness as a ground attack aircraft. Not just the thousands of vehicles destroyed, though those numbers were staggering. Not just the millions of rounds fired or tons of bombs dropped, though those statistics were impressive. The real effectiveness was measured in the complete psychological dominance the Thunderbolt achieved over German ground forces. By 1945, the mere sound of approaching P-47s was enough to break German unit cohesion and render organised resistance impossible. The flying milk bottle that Luftwaffe pilots had mocked in 1943 had become the flying hammer that crushed German military power in 1945. The thunder had spoken, and nothing could stand against it. The P-47's ground attack evolution in the Pacific theatre deserves equal recognition, though it remains overshadowed by its European exploits. When the 348th Fighter Group arrived in New Guinea in June 1943 with their Thunderbolts, they faced a completely different operational environment. The vast distances of the Pacific, the brutal tropical climate, the lack of infrastructure, and Japanese tactics that differed fundamentally from German approaches all presented unique challenges. Yet the P-47 proved equally devastating in this theatre, adapting to become the primary American ground attack aircraft across the Southwest Pacific. The initial Pacific deployment of P-47s focused on bomber escort and air superiority missions against Japanese fighters. The Thunderbolt's advantages in firepower and durability quickly became apparent. Japanese aircraft, built for maneuverability and range at the expense of armour and structural strength, proved catastrophically vulnerable to the P-47's 8 machine guns. A 2-second burst from a Thunderbolt could literally tear a Zero fighter apart. Japanese pilots, accustomed to fragile opponents that could be destroyed with limited cannon fire, discovered that their weapons barely scratched the heavily armoured American fighter. But it was in ground attack that the P-47 truly excelled in the Pacific. The Japanese reliance on dispersed, camouflaged positions hidden in jungle terrain created different challenges than the open roads and rail lines of Europe. P-47 pilots developed specialized tactics for attacking targets in dense vegetation. The standard approach involved systematic area saturation. Flights would work over suspected Japanese positions with overlapping strafing runs, the heavy machine gun fire literally defoliating the jungle and destroying anything beneath. The armour-piercing incendiary ammunition proved especially effective, as the incendiary compound would ignite the dense, dry underbrush, creating fires that exposed previously hidden positions. The destruction of Japanese shipping and coastal installations became a P-47 specialty in the Pacific. Barges, small coastal vessels, and supply dumps clustered along shorelines presented ideal targets for the Thunderbolt's firepower. A typical anti-shipping strike involved a diving attack with bombs against larger vessels, followed by systematic strafing of anything that moved in the water. The 50 caliber armour-piercing rounds could penetrate the thin hulls of Japanese barges and small transports, often causing catastrophic explosions when fuel or ammunition was struck. Captain William Banks of the 460th Fighter Squadron described a mission against Japanese barges near Wewak in October 1943. We found about 30 barges clustered in a small bay, probably waiting for nightfall to make a supply run. We made 4 passes, each aircraft firing continuously. The water was literally boiling from our bullets. Barges were exploding, burning, sinking. In 3 minutes we destroyed the entire flotilla. The Japanese on shore were firing everything they had at us, but the P-47 just shrugged it off. We all made it home without serious damage. The Japanese airfield attacks in the Pacific demonstrated another aspect of P-47 ground attack capability. Unlike in Europe, where heavily defended Luftwaffe airfields required careful planning and often resulted in significant losses, Japanese airfields in the Southwest Pacific were relatively lightly defended and proved vulnerable to systematic destruction. P-47 groups developed airfield suppression tactics that combined bombs, rockets, and sustained strafing to destroy aircraft, fuel dumps, and runway facilities in single missions. On October 11, 1943, Colonel Neil Kirby led 4 P-47s against Wehrmacht airfield, where intelligence indicated over 100 Japanese aircraft were based. The attack became legendary. Kirby's flight approached at low altitude, achieving complete surprise. They made repeated passes over the airfield, strafing parked aircraft with devastating effect. Japanese fighters attempting to take off were shot down immediately. Ground crews fleeing the aircraft were caught in the open. In 20 minutes of continuous attack, the 4 Thunderbolts destroyed 36 Japanese aircraft on the ground and shot down 6 more attempting to intercept. Kirby personally destroyed 12 aircraft that day, earning him the Medal of Honor. He later commented that the P-47's ammunition capacity was critical, allowing sustained fire without worrying about running dry at a critical moment. The support of amphibious landings in the Pacific became another crucial P-47 mission. As American forces island hopped toward Japan, each landing required intensive air support to suppress Japanese defenses and destroy reinforcements before they could reach the beaches. The P-47's ability to carry heavy bomb loads while maintaining fighter capability made it ideal for this role. Thunderbolts would provide top cover against Japanese air attack while simultaneously bombing and strafing defensive positions, artillery emplacements, and troop concentrations. During the invasion of the Philippines in October 1944, P-47 groups flew thousands of close air support sorties. The coordination between ground forces and air support reached new levels of effectiveness. Forward air controllers embedded with infantry units could call in Thunderbolt strikes within minutes, directing fire onto Japanese positions that were holding up advances. The psychological impact on Japanese troops was similar to that experienced by Germans in Europe. The combination of bombs, rockets, and machine gun fire delivered with precision was simply overwhelming. Lieutenant Robert de Haven, flying ground support missions over Leyte, described the effectiveness of P-47 close air support. The ground troops would mark Japanese positions with coloured smoke, and we'd roll in immediately. The Japanese were dug into reinforced positions that were nearly immune to artillery, but our bombs and rockets could penetrate their bunkers. We'd make multiple passes, dropping bombs, firing rockets, then strafing with the 50s. The armour-piercing rounds would penetrate the reinforced concrete and explode inside. After our strikes, the infantry could move forward with minimal resistance. The Japanese positions were simply obliterated. The distances in the Pacific theatre pushed P-47 range to its limits, driving the development of the P-47N model specifically for Pacific operations. This variant featured increased fuel capacity through wet wings that incorporated additional fuel cells, extending range to over 2,000 miles. The P-47N could escort B-29 bombers on raids against Japan itself, providing fighter cover while maintaining ground attack capability. The combination of extreme range, heavy armament, and legendary durability made the P-47N the ultimate Pacific fighter bomber. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan in 1945 relied heavily on P-47 support. While B-29s dropped incendiaries on Japanese cities, P-47s attacked the transportation infrastructure, airfields, and military installations that supported Japanese defences. The systematic destruction of Japanese rail lines, bridges, and coastal shipping created the same cascading failures that had paralysed Germany. By mid-1945, Japanese industry was effectively isolated, unable to receive raw materials or ship finished products. The P-47's contribution to this strangling of Japanese military-industrial capacity was enormous. The final months of the Pacific War saw P-47s involved in the most intensive close air support operations of the entire conflict. As American forces prepared for the invasion of Japan, Thunderbolt groups systematically attacked every military target within range. Airfields were cratered and destroyed. Coastal defences were bombed into rubble. Rail lines were cut in thousands of locations. Harbour facilities were wrecked. The objective was to so thoroughly devastate Japanese defences that the planned invasion would face minimal organised resistance. The scale of destruction was staggering. In July 1945 alone, 5th Air Force P-47s destroyed over 400 locomotives, 2,500 rail cars, 1,800 vehicles, 83 coastal vessels and 47 bridges. They cut rail lines in over 300 locations and attacked 156 airfields. This level of sustained destruction, maintained month after month, made continued Japanese resistance increasingly futile. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the P-47's contribution to that surrender was undeniable. The Japanese military had been systematically destroyed from the air, with Thunderbolts playing a central role in that destruction. The technical development of P-47 ground attack armament continued throughout the war, with each improvement increasing lethality. The addition of the bazooka rocket tube adaptation allowed P-47s to carry larger numbers of smaller rockets, useful for area saturation attacks. Experimental installations included 75mm cannon mounted in specially modified aircraft, though these proved impractical for operational use. Napalm bombs, devastating incendiary weapons that spread flaming gasoline gel over wide areas, became standard P-47 ordnance for attacking Japanese jungle positions and fortifications. The napalm attacks demonstrated the P-47's versatility in adapting to different tactical requirements. Standard procedure involved dropping napalm canisters on suspected Japanese positions, immediately igniting the jellied gasoline with incendiary bullets from the machine guns. The resulting firestorm would consume everything in a 50-yard radius, burning through jungle cover to expose hidden positions and bunkers. The psychological effect was profound. Japanese troops dreaded napalm attacks above all other weapons, with survivors describing the horror of inescapable fire that consumed everything. Captain James Watkins of the 508th Fighter Squadron described a napalm attack on a Japanese strongpoint in March 1945. We dropped napalm canisters along the ridge where the Japanese were dug in, then made strafing passes to ignite it. The entire hillside erupted in flames. The fire was so intense we could feel the heat at 1,000 feet altitude. Nothing could survive that inferno. The ground troops moved in an hour later and found the position completely destroyed. The Japanese had been defending it for 3 weeks against conventional attacks. We eliminated it in 5 minutes. The training of P-47 pilots for ground attack missions evolved significantly as the war progressed. Early war training focused almost exclusively on air-to-air combat, with limited attention to bombing or strafing. By 1944, training programs included extensive ground attack practice, with pilots spending hundreds of hours learning dive bombing, rocket firing, and low-altitude navigation. The curriculum included detailed instruction on target identification, defensive tactics against ground fire, and coordination with ground forces. The gunnery training particularly emphasized the unique characteristics of the P-47's 8-gun battery. Pilots learned to manage ammunition expenditure, understanding that even with 3,400 rounds, sustained firing would deplete ammunition in less than 30 seconds. They practiced convergence patterns, learning how to adjust sight settings for different engagement ranges. They studied the ballistics of armor-piercing versus standard ball ammunition, understanding when each was most effective. This comprehensive training produced pilots who could employ the P-47's weapons with devastating precision. The maintenance challenges of keeping P-47s operational in combat conditions were substantial but manageable due to the aircraft's robust design. The R-2800 engine, while complex, was remarkably reliable when properly maintained. Ground crews became expert at field repairs, often cannibalizing damaged aircraft to keep others flying. The hydraulic systems, while sophisticated, were accessible and repairable. The electrical systems, critical for gunfiring and bomb release, were designed with redundancy that allowed operation even after significant battle damage. Master Sergeant Thomas Riley, a crew chief with the 56th Fighter Group, described maintaining P-47s in forward airfields in France during late 1944. We'd work 16-hour days keeping the birds flying. The P-47 was incredibly tough, but it needed constant attention. The engines required careful monitoring. The guns had to be cleaned and harmonized after every mission. The hydraulic systems leaked constantly and needed regular servicing, but the aircraft was forgiving. You could fix things in the field that would ground other fighters. I saw aircraft come back with catastrophic damage, holes you could put your head through, control surfaces shredded, engines barely running. We'd work all night and have them ready for the next day's mission. The P-47 wanted to keep fighting. The logistics of supplying P-47 operations were staggering in scale. Each mission required 100 gallons of 100-octane aviation fuel per aircraft minimum, with combat missions often consuming 200 gallons or more. The ammunition consumption averaged 1,500 rounds per sortie, requiring constant resupply from depots in England or rear areas in the Pacific. bombs and rockets had to be transported forward, stored safely and loaded efficiently. The entire system required thousands of support personnel, hundreds of trucks, complex supply chains stretching across oceans. Yet American logistics proved equal to the challenge. Fuel was always available, ammunition dumps were always stocked, bombs and rockets arrived continuously. Spare parts were plentiful. This logistical superiority translated directly into operational capability. P-47 groups could maintain intensive operations day after day without pause, while German and Japanese forces struggled with constant shortages that degraded their effectiveness. An American fighter squadron in late 1944 could fly more sorties in a week than an entire Luftwaffe fighter wing, simply because the Americans had the fuel, ammunition, and spare parts to keep flying. The human cost of P-47 ground attack operations, while lower than many other combat roles, was still significant. Flying low-altitude missions through intense ground fire was inherently dangerous. Even the P-47's legendary armour couldn't protect against direct hits from heavy anti-aircraft guns. Pilots who flew hundreds of ground attack missions faced cumulative risk that eventually caught up with many. The casualty rates for P-47 units, while lower than bomber crews or other fighter types, still meant that completing a full combat tour was never guaranteed. The stories of individual P-47 pilots who survived dozens or hundreds of ground attack missions revealed the stress and danger of this role. Captain Walker Mahurin completed 85 combat missions before being shot down over occupied France and evading capture. He described ground attack as more psychologically demanding than air combat, because you had to deliberately fly into the most dangerous environment, low and slow through concentrated defensive fire, whereas air combat involved maneuvering at high altitude where you had options and visibility. Every strafing pass meant flying through streams of tracer fire, knowing that one lucky shot could end you. The evolution of German and Japanese anti-aircraft defences in response to P-47 attacks drove tactical adaptations on both sides. The Germans dramatically increased flak gun deployment along roads and rail lines, attempting to make low-altitude attacks suicidal. They developed mobile flak batteries that could quickly reposition to threatened areas. They trained gun crews specifically on engaging fast, low-altitude targets. Yet these measures proved only partially effective. The P-47's speed, armour and attack profile made it remarkably difficult to hit, and even when hit, hard to bring down. The Japanese, lacking Germany's industrial capacity for heavy anti-aircraft guns, relied more on light automatic weapons and small-caliber guns. They deployed these in large numbers, creating walls of fire that American pilots had to fly through. The Japanese also became expert at camouflage and concealment, attempting to hide targets from air observation. P-47 pilots countered with systematic search patterns and area weapons like napalm that didn't require precise target identification. The tactical evolution became a continuous cycle of measure and countermeasure. By early 1945, the air supremacy achieved by Allied forces, with P-47s playing a central role, was so complete that German and Japanese ground forces operated under conditions of near-total vulnerability. Any movement in daylight invited immediate air attack. Any concentration of forces, vehicles, or supplies became a priority target. Defensive positions, no matter how well fortified, could be systematically destroyed by repeated airstrikes. The Wehrmacht and Imperial Japanese Army, which had conquered vast territories through mobile warfare, were reduced to static defense and night movement. The psychological warfare aspect of P-47 operations deserves recognition. The Allies deliberately publicized the effectiveness of fighter-bomber attacks, both to boost home front morale and to demoralize enemy forces. Captured Germans and Japanese were shown gun camera footage of attacks, demonstrating the futility of resistance. Leaflets dropped over German positions depicted burning vehicles and warned soldiers that daylight movement meant death. Radio broadcasts described specific attacks, naming units destroyed and casualties inflicted. This psychological campaign reinforced the visceral terror that frontline troops felt when they heard approaching aircraft. The post-war analysis of P-47 effectiveness in ground attack reached unanimous conclusions. The Thunderbolt was the most effective ground attack aircraft of World War II when measured by total destruction inflicted, survivability, versatility, and operational availability. Its combination of heavy armament, bomb-carrying capacity, structural strength, and pilot protection created a weapon system that could not be effectively countered by defences available in 1944 and 1945. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that fighter-bomber attacks, primarily by P-47s, contributed more to German military defeat than any other single factor except strategic bombing of industrial targets. The legacy of P-47 ground attack operations influenced military aviation for generations. The concept of the multi-role fighter, capable of air superiority and ground attack, became standard for fighter design. The emphasis on pilot protection, structural strength, and weapons capacity over maximum performance reflected lessons learned from Thunderbolt operations. The tactics developed by P-47 pilots, dive bombing, rocket attacks, area strafing, became standard procedure taught in air forces worldwide. The German perspective on P-47 ground attacks, documented in post-war interviews and captured documents, revealed the profound impact these operations had on Wehrmacht effectiveness and morale. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in Italy, stated in post-war interrogation that Allied air superiority, particularly fighter-bomber attacks, made defensive operations impossible and offensive operations suicidal. He estimated that his forces operated at less than 30% effectiveness due to constant air attack, with P-47s being specifically mentioned as the most feared ground attack aircraft. General der Panzertruppen Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded armoured forces on both eastern and western fronts, compared Soviet and American air power in a 1946 interview. On the eastern front, Soviet aircraft attacked us, but we could still manoeuvre and operate in daylight. Our training and tactics gave us advantages that offset their numbers. On the western front, after mid-1944, daylight operations were impossible. American fighter bombers, especially the P-47, made movements suicidal. We couldn't mass forces for counterattacks. We couldn't bring up supplies. We couldn't even communicate effectively because radio traffic invited immediate airstrikes. The P-47 destroyed our mobility, and without mobility, armour is useless. The Japanese perspective, documented through post-war interrogations of surviving officers, was similarly stark. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, who commanded Japanese forces in the Philippines, described Allied air power as the decisive factor in Japanese defeat. He specifically mentioned that American fighters could carry bombs equal to light bombers while maintaining air superiority capability, making it impossible to defend against them. Japanese troops learned that any visible concentration invited immediate air attack, forcing dispersal that made coordinated operations impossible. Admiral Matome Ugaki, commanding Japanese naval air forces, wrote in his diary entries from 1945 about the futility of operations against overwhelming American air power. He described watching American fighters, particularly P-47s, systematically destroying Japanese facilities with apparent impunity. He noted that Japanese anti-aircraft fire seemed ineffective, that American aircraft absorbed damage that would destroy Japanese planes, and continued their attacks. His final diary entries before his death expressed the hopelessness of continuing resistance against such material superiority. The industrial achievement represented by P-47 production and deployment in ground attack roles cannot be overstated. Republic Aviation and its contractors produced over 15,000 Thunderbolts during the war, each one a complex machine requiring precision manufacturing. The fact that most of these aircraft eventually transitioned to ground attack roles, requiring additional equipment installation and specialized training, demonstrated American industrial flexibility and adaptability. The same factories that had been producing traditional air superiority fighters adapted to produce fighter bombers without significant delays or production decreases. The ammunition production supporting P-47 operations was equally impressive. By 1944, American ammunition plants were producing over 50 million 50-caliber rounds monthly, with significant percentages dedicated to P-47 operations. Each round was manufactured to exacting specifications, ensuring reliable function in the synchronized gun systems. The quality control was such that weapon malfunctions due to ammunition defects were extremely rare, giving pilots confidence that their guns would function when needed. This reliability, combined with enormous ammunition capacity, made the P-47 uniquely effective. The bomb and rocket production similarly demonstrated American industrial capacity. The 5-inch HVAR rocket, developed specifically for the P-47, required complex manufacturing including shaped charge warheads, precision rocket motors, and reliable electrical firing systems, yet production ramped up to hundreds of thousands of rockets annually, providing unlimited supplies for operational units. The various bomb types, ranging from 100-pound general-purpose bombs to 2,000-pound armor-piercing bombs, were produced in quantities that allowed P-47 pilots to select optimal ordnance for each target type. The final accounting of P-47 ground attack effectiveness must consider not just vehicles destroyed or casualties inflicted, but the strategic paralysis inflicted on enemy forces. By mid-1944 in Europe and mid-1945 in the Pacific, German and Japanese ground forces were effectively pinned in place, unable to maneuver, unable to resupply, unable to mass for counterattacks. This paralysis was primarily due to air attack, with P-47s contributing enormously to this effect. The inability to move or concentrate forces meant that Allied ground forces faced enemies who were already defeated strategically, regardless of their tactical positions or defensive strength. The comparison between early war and late war military mobility illustrated this impact dramatically. In 1940, German armoured divisions could move hundreds of miles in days, concentrating overwhelming force at decisive points. By 1944, these same units required days to move a few miles, and only at night, arriving piecemeal and under strength due to air attack during movement. Japanese forces in 1942 could maneuver freely across Pacific Islands, reinforcing threatened positions and launching counterattacks. By 1945, any movement invited immediate destruction from the air, forcing static defense that could be systematically reduced. The human stories behind the statistics reveal the real impact of P-47 ground attack operations. German truck drivers who watched their vehicles explode around them. Japanese soldiers crouched in bunkers as bombs and rockets destroyed their positions. American pilots who pressed attacks through walls of tracer fire. Ground crews who worked through the night repairing battle damage. The intelligence officers who selected targets. The forward air controllers who coordinated strikes. Each played a role in the vast machinery of destruction that the P-47 represented. In the final analysis, the P-47 Thunderbolt's transformation into the supreme ground attack aircraft of World War II represented a convergence of technology, tactics, training, and industrial capacity that produced unprecedented military effectiveness. The aircraft itself provided the platform, rugged, powerful, heavily armed. The pilots provided the skill and courage to employ it against heavily defended targets. The support system provided the fuel, ammunition, and maintenance to keep it flying. The result was a weapon system that fundamentally altered the nature of ground warfare, making traditional military operations impossible and contributing decisively to Allied victory. The thunder that rolled across the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific in 1944 and 1945 was more than the sound of Pratt & Whitney engines. It was the sound of industrial America crushing its enemies beneath an avalanche of steel, explosives, and lead, delivered with precision by young men who had turned an interceptor into an instrument of devastation. The Germans and Japanese who survived those attacks never forgot the terror. The Allied soldiers who advanced behind that curtain of fire never forgot their gratitude, and military historians never forgot the lesson. Air power, properly employed with the right aircraft, tactics, and resources, could break armies and decide wars.